Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this panel right here. We're going to be discussing cybersecurity today, and we're very fortunate to have an incredibly distinguished panelists, which I'll briefly introduce, and then we can go down the line here, starting with Richard, and can elaborate a little bit more on what you're working on and a little bit about your background, and then we'll dive into a lot of the issues that cybersecurity is impacting right now in terms of resiliency, infrastructure, and a variety of number of other issues. And we'll also have a Q&A if you guys have questions for our panelists. So briefly, we have Richard Hartneck of the University of Cincinnati, Greg Akers, Trust and Security at Cisco, Kris Huntington at Nexigen, James Walden at North Kentucky University, and then we have Mark Schittner from Centric Consulting. So I'll pass it to Richard.
So I'm head of the Department of Political Science, and you wonder what's a political scientist hanging out with all these technologists for. About 28 years or so ago, most of my work was focused on nuclear weapons, and DoD came along and said, so we got this thing called a browser. You know, what do you think the implications might be? And I said, oh, it's a problem. And so I've been working on that problem for about 28 years. So I work at this at the national strategy and policy level, and we'll give you a little peek on some of that perspective as we move on. So I used to think about cities as targets. You know, they just had a bullseye and megatonnage around them. And I still think actually they're going to be target-enriched environments. So.
Thanks, Rich. Greg Akers, Cisco Systems. I've been there 24 years. So I'm the cyber guy. When something goes wrong, I get called. So if you think about Target, Home Depot, the stuff you've heard about in the news, WannaCry on Mother's Day this past year, I was talking to the White House on my vacation driving back from Florida with my wife looking at me going, this Mother's Day sucks. So I'm the guy that they call when something's gone wrong and they haven't seen it before. Today, what I spend most of my time doing is actually granting money to research organizations across the globe to study cyber problems that we think we're going to have to deal with in the 5, 10, 15-year time horizon.
I'm Kris Huntington with Nexigen, Chief Information Security Officer running our security brand, as well as working on the IEEE Smart Cities Standards Committee with Venture Smarter and a few other groups as well. We're working on a lot in the IoT security space as well as the NIST cybersecurity framework space.
I'm James Walden. I'm a professor of computer science and director of NKU's Center for Information Security. I teach a wide variety of security classes, from secure software engineering to incident response. And I do research in building machine learning models to look at source code and binary code and try to figure out where the problems are.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Schneider. I am with Centric Consulting. I am one of the senior managers at the firm. What I typically do is work with clients and helping to prevent security incidences. What we will typically do is go in and is either through assessments or hopefully not through actual security incident, help work with the clients to improve their infrastructure and their security posturing so that they don't have someone calling them on Mother's Day asking, you know, why is your company on the front page of the news?
Thank you, everyone, for providing that brief background. And I'd like to start with Greg. You have an incredible experience dealing with various threats. I'd love for you to tell our audience about what are your concerns about infrastructure and how do you see the need to work on that foundational layer of what we're building?
Sure. So let me first say that it's all about the data. The pervasiveness of data that we're seeing in this explosion of technology across the globe is causing us to step back and think about the world very differently than we ever have before. In places in the past where we were struggling to get information, now we've got a plethora of information we've got to deal with. The point I guess I'd make to you guys is this: any information that you use for societal benefit or for economic benefit could be turned in a way that could be used detrimentally to you as well. Let me give you a specific example. As I was sitting in the audience this morning listening to the reporting about where opioid incidents were occurring across the city, I was thinking, now how could a bad guy take that information and use it nefariously against us? I And my first thought was, man, if I was in a drug cartel or an organized crime entity, I could take that information, know where to go sell opioids into the community and make money. You have to think about data as being the asset of the world we're moving into, and think about how to protect it. You have to think about it in ways we've never thought about before. I'm going to give you an anecdotal, real-time example of something that just happened to me today. Got a call when I was finishing up another call at lunchtime. One of our incident response team members said, "I need to talk to you, Greg." Okay, what's going on? There's an employee that of your organization that you're very close to, and I won't tell you who it is or what the role is, that has gotten 4 emails in the last 2 weeks from a nation-state intelligence service cyber actor. And he says, we're certain that they are actually targeting you, trying to get to you through this employee. Okay, tell me about the tradecraft, tell me what's going on. He took me through it. The good news is the infrastructure caught it and demurred most of the problem. The bad news is a couple got through. The good news is the employee was smart enough not to click on the link. And in fact, I should tell you that the tradecraft didn't require the link be clicked on to be actually effective. But my point by telling you this is that information and data becomes that commodity, and what this actor appeared to be trying to do was to attack my information and my data through this employee. So you have to feel like at every point along the way, you have to understand what your data is doing, what it's being used for, what it might be potentially used for, and how you protect it. And in my view, Mitch, to answer your question very directly, the only way to protect that data is to do it by way of the infrastructure that the data either is moving on or it resides on. There's no other way to do it. I'll give you one other quick example and I'll turn the mic back to you. Many of you probably heard that we announced as an industry last Monday that there was a vulnerability in a protocol called WPA2. It's part of the Wi-Fi protocol that we all know and love. And in fact, that protocol is broken in ways that adversaries can make use of it to actually attack people, cyber attack people. What we found out when we went to go fix that problem was there had been so many deployments of that technology in devices like IoT devices. So think about cameras, video systems, doorbells, all the stuff that we know and use in our households today as conveniences. In many of those products, that data that was being acquired from them could not be protected. And what we heard from the IoT vendors was, we don't have the economic wherewithal to go back and fix many of those things. So it's up to the networks, it's up to the infrastructure, it's up to the things they connect to actually protect and defend those devices. There are stories in the medical industry and other industries that are similar to this, but the point is, it's about protecting the data, and it's by using the infrastructure that the data is riding on top of or being stored on.
Absolutely, Greg. I think a lot of people don't think about that foundational layer of infrastructure. When companies and individuals think about cybersecurity, thinking about what is the threat, and a lot of times, as you mentioned, the threat is very human, clicking on a link. But the threat is also becoming so sophisticated that it's just very difficult to keep pace with that. And companies like Cisco and NextGen and universities every day face hundreds of millions, some if not even more than that, of attacks, which you can imagine the amount of infrastructure and resiliency as a company that you have to implement. And Richard, I'd like to get your take on this from a policy perspective. You've been deeply ingrained in this world. How should governments be thinking about this, and how should corporations be looking to incorporate this into their policy?
Sure, thanks. I'll pick up on the anecdote that Greg just shared, right? And what jumped out at me there was, it was actually a combination of infrastructure and behavior, right? So the employee knew through some good cybersecurity hygiene, right, and practices, how to manage that, get that back up the information chain, right, so that this thing could be remediated, even if the infrastructure had taken out a good portion of it, right? And so I think that's part of where we have to go from a policy standpoint, is recognize that cybersecurity, right, is not a technical problem. It's a behavioral, social, political, and economic challenge in a technically fluid environment. Want me to say that again? But that's my little mantra. And I'll stick with it. And so, but I think it comes down to first principles. And I've been suggesting that for all the time and effort that we've put into this, we actually still haven't gotten the first principles right. Right. So if you start off and read any U.S. government strategy or policy document, frankly, if you go to a YouTube and look at most any CEO's annual report, right, they will say the internet or cyberspace, it's global and interconnected, right? And then everything that follows in those strategy documents assumes that our solution set is segmentation. I mean, we throw that interconnectedness out the window, right? It's a throwaway line. And what I would argue is that that's where we need to start, right? We actually have to accept the fact that this is an interconnected domain. And so what strategies of interconnectedness do we need to put in place? And that requires fundamental different thinking about how we are organized, how we behave, and then the authorities that flow from both those missions and organizational sets. I'll leave two last points on this. So that interconnectedness as a structural starting point leads to a common condition, a core condition, and that is constant contact. Not imminent contact, not potential contact, but constant contact. And we don't know what that, again, in the military sphere, we talk about areas of hostility, right? We segment that off, right? And then we're only going to have contact with the adversary in that space. It makes no sense in this domain, right? This is not a war-fighting domain. It's a interconnected domain in which we may have to war-fight. That's a fundamentally different way of thinking about our strategic challenge that we have. The final component of that, thanks to all these really bright guys that build the technology, right, is that this damn space is changing every minute, every second, right? And so from a security standpoint, the fascinating aspect of that for me is that you have simultaneously changing the terrain in which you're going to maneuver and the means by which you maneuver across that terrain. And it's the same zeros and ones, right? So this isn't the ship that sits on the water. This isn't the plane that flies through the air, right? That adds a layer of complication to this that we, again, haven't got our heads around right. And so ultimately, and here's the punchline, right, that leads us to a strategic environment of offense persistence. Not offense dominance, not offense advantage, but offense persistence. There will always be someone out there who's continuously have the capacity and willingness to seek the cyber initiative, and we have to redraw and rethink our way of securing both the infrastructure and the user behind that infrastructure in a persistent environment. That's the challenge from a strategy standpoint, and right now at the national level, we're very, very uncomfortable with that.
Richard, that's spot on. And I served in the U.S. Congress as a staffer working on cybersecurity for almost a decade. And it's really incredible to think where we have come from, but the territory that we still have to gain. We're not anywhere near where the policy needs to be adaptable and flexible to work with companies and universities and innovators over here. And on that note, Kris, I'd love to get your take. As Chief Security Officer, rapidly growing, innovative company, how do you think about these issues? What approach, as Richard was talking about, how do you approach this issue?
So there's a lot of discussion in the industry right now around a shift from the detection or the prevention mindset to the detection mindset. And what we found in practice is that companies that move strictly to the detection mindset are often 2 or 3 steps behind. So what we're finding is that it's a very intricate balance of protection combined with detection that allows us to be ahead of the ball game, but also able to respond if there is a specific threat that drives some kind of event happening that's going on in one of our clients. The main issue that we have, though, is that a lot of companies still, to this day, are bad at the basics. They're not good at patching. They're not good at remediation of flaws that they find in their software that get pushed off into a sprint that's 6 months out, and we can't patch until that happens. So security has a legitimacy problem to a certain extent in companies right now, and that we, for years, were the boy that cried wolf, and now we have to be the guy that's getting everything done because now all of a sudden we have this board presence because of the things like Equifax or the breaches like Home Depot and Target. So what we're doing is getting in front of it with good, resilient policy that allows the entire organization to understand where we start, why we're doing things, and how we're doing things in order to allow the development team to be participative in security, to allow the IT operations team to be participative, and to allow every person in the company to be participative and to be educated as to what the threats are. So when we talk about detection, the number one way that we're detecting phishing emails is by people sending them to us and saying, hey, I just got this. I don't know if anybody else clicked it, but we can find out from that email, okay, yeah, it looks like 3 or 4 people did click it, and we can find out who it was and get to them faster. With the average breach lasting 230 to 240 days, we've got time to respond in a lot of these incidents. But we just have to have that detection. So building the human firewall and allowing people the skills that they need to help us be detection mechanisms is critical to our performance as a company. Teaming that with technology and really being aggressive towards our patch cycles, being aggressive towards our lifecycle management, and being aggressive towards the things that secure our data.
You know, I think that's really incredible perspective in the chair that you sit here, you know, literally and figuratively. And James, you work on software matters, trying to find vulnerabilities. How do you see this landscape? You're at the heart of research, just like Richard is here too, and more on the software development side. So how do you see this field evolving?
Yeah, I'd say probably the big change we're going to see is a move from, I guess, a worry about data to a worry about subversion. So Uber calls it a self-driving car. I call it an automated kidnapping device. So as computerized smart devices move more and more into the real world, they can be used to cause physical harm. You know, ransomware has been ransoming your data and having access to your devices. Ransomware is increasingly found in hospitals and medical practices, and instead of ransoming their device, they can ransom your pacemaker or your insulin pump. I did a security project with a diabetic student, and when he got a replacement insulin pump, we hacked his old one. And the scary thing is that it was really trivial to do. It makes a lot of sense for these implanted medical devices to have wireless access because you don't want an operation every time someone adjusts your insulin dosage. But they really never thought about security. And so a lot of these devices just don't have a way to ever fix their security problems. And that's very much true with cars, too. It took GM something like 5 years to hack a security update system into their OnStar system. And through that whole period, basically, all the vulnerabilities people found for 5 years could be used to take over your car. So we really need to, as we move software into more of the physical world, we need to take security seriously from the very planning stages of the device. Everything from toys to pacemakers really can have a serious impact on us.
Absolutely. And Mark, I think you would have incredible insight. At Centric, you collaborate with a lot of companies, helping them to understand the cybersecurity space and how to protect themselves. How do you see, if we can briefly shift in the context of smart cities, IoT, data, balancing all these different things, a company wants to maximize revenue, but also wants to do so in a responsible process that is going to be responsible to its shareholders as well. What's the balance between privacy, security, building products, and baking in security at what point?
Sure. Well, I think one of the themes that's been brought up here with my fellow colleagues, and also it was brought up this morning, is security is just not a technical component. There's definitely an educational component. And one of the things that I've seen time and time again with various organizations is when talking about security with C-level individuals, there's a component, there's a kind of an arbitrary thought about, well, there's a technical piece. Talk to my CIO, or talk to my CTO, or talk to the technical staff. When really it almost starts with education. It starts with, well, what are your assets? Do you understand what your assets are? Is the business model you're using considering how those assets could be turned against you, or how those assets could be used? Someone else could use those assets in nefarious ways. So I think that's really a key starting point, is when you start looking at smart cities, you're going to have to look at different ways of doing things, which may be starting with different ways of legislating certain pieces of bills and laws to allow more flexible security, allow more flexibility to be able to respond to security events or security situations, so you can effectively mitigate something and you're not stuck using something that was put in place, you know, as early as 2 years ago that has to be fixed. Look at different business processes, look at different ways of doing business. I think some of the traditional ways, when applied to a smart city, may not make the most sense. So for example, the traditional way of, let's say, looking at parking. You know, it was mentioned earlier that parking, I believe it was mentioned, it was the second largest revenue generation for a city. Well, when you look at the way, say, certain cities will potentially have a law that says, hey, you have to have X number of parking spaces based on the size of your company. Well, if you're trying to reduce parking spaces, that doesn't make sense. So you need to have legislation or legislators that will have the courage to actually challenge some of those laws and say, this doesn't make sense. We need to change these laws so that they can accommodate smart city planning, smart city technologies. And then applying it to the business side, more at the company level, looking at those companies that are innovating in the IoT space, look at how their business model matches up with a security model. Are they making products that are going to be disposable within 5 years? If that's the mindset, that business model is probably not going to be allowing them to update patches or put new firmware in to address security concerns, versus a company that's saying, no, we're going to make this device and it's going to be around for 10 years or more. We're going to build it secure. We're going to allow that device to be patchable, to be updatable. That way, if there is a security issue, we can apply those patches. So it's a little different mindset, little different metrics are used around those two different examples of how you would go about applying a business model to those, versus just saying, hey, I want to make something and, you know, I'm just going to ship it the first time I can get it to work, and we'll go from there.
Kris, did you want to comment?
The one thing that we found throughout the years of IT security is that those devices that typically are supposed to last 3 or 4 years, I know people that are still using iPhone 4s. Apple never intended the iPhone 4 to be still being used today. But those devices have a tendency to persist well beyond the lifespan that they were ever planned to persist across. So we have to look at these as no longer, this is going to have a 3-year lifespan and I think it's going to be secure for the next 3 years, but more on the, okay, how am I going to respond to that? And to your point, we have to understand that we don't know when the next vulnerability is going to be found in what we're doing. WPA was the best standard we had for years and years, and then 2 weeks ago it was earth-shattering when we found out that there was a vulnerability in it, and it's changing things drastically, even for brand new devices.
I'll jump in. You want to go first? You can go first. Okay. Well, actually, you're going to say something technical. Go ahead.
I was going to say something technical. Yeah, so I want to tell you an example. I went to Mayo Clinic about 2 years ago, and I went into a research organization, and they showed me this huge supercomputer, a Cray YMP, and all these other computers sitting beside it. I said, what are you doing with that? We're collecting all of our network data and analyzing it for vulnerabilities. Okay, how many devices do you have? Oh, we have hundreds of thousands of devices, but you only have tens of thousands of employees. Those are legacy medical devices that we don't have any other way to protect. So what we're doing is gathering all the data about the medical devices and looking for the vulnerabilities that we see active on the network so we can remediate them when we have a problem. Guys, everyone can't buy a YMP and all the associated equipment they had, but the notion that you have to watch what's going on the infrastructure and you have to be able to react to it and deal with it in a way, no matter whether it was Windows 95 or whether it was a WPA device that never got patched because of this vulnerability we heard about 2 weeks ago. There has to be a means by which we detect these things and we can remediate them. And the other thing I like to tell people is, okay, if I look at something and the question is that bad or is that good? What's the harm if I say it's bad and I stop it? If I'm wrong, maybe I save myself a call from somebody that was upset if I let it go, but if I stop and it was bad, I've really done something important. So we have to understand that we have to allow our infrastructures and our devices to actually accommodate for the fact, as Kris was just saying, that there are going to be problems out there, and we may end up allowing some of those devices onto networks, but we won't let them do the things that they may want to do because they are vulnerable or because they're infected.
Yeah, and let me pick up on that exact theme. I'm just following you perfectly. You're just throwing me the yeah. Right, it is how we understand vulnerability, right? And so as a political scientist, if you just went back 16, 17 months and you asked me cybersecurity with regard to elections, everything that was being written at that time was about the vote, right? It was going to be counting the vote. That's what we were worried about, right? And in fact, the vulnerability was the voter, right? So what we have to understand again is this is as we think through, I like to twist Sun Tzu. Everybody likes to quote Sun Tzu, right? But the old quote, right, you got to know your enemy better than you know yourself. I think in cyberspace, right, you need to know your vulnerabilities better than anybody knows your vulnerabilities, right? And what that comes down to is a prioritization of what are the crown jewels, right? What do I have to have in my data set that can't be open to manipulation or subversion, right? Whether it be the data itself or whether it be the IoT platform upon which that data is being moved across, right? And so getting down to a sense of, because we can't defend everything. We can't defend this whole space. That's why it's offense persistent, right? But we can defend, right? And this is what makes it fundamentally different, right, than where we went, say, with nukes, right? Nukes, we woke up one day and we said, it's not in our hands anymore, right? Security is going to come in me getting in the head of my enemy. That's where we came up with deterrence, right? There you go, right? But now security, that doesn't work here, right? I can't get into the head because there's too many heads, right? I can't get this in the intentional space. I can't get this in the proactive space. So getting back to, I think it was Kris that talked about some of this, is all about anticipation, right? If we're going to get better in security, right, we have to be anticipating better than our adversary, right? And part of that anticipation is not only just the physical vulnerability, right, but it's ultimately this decision about what is consequential and what can I move into the inconsequential effect bucket, right? Inconsequential effect doesn't, I use that term very, very specifically, right? It doesn't mean that these threats go away. It means that we're going to accept the fact that they're going to persist, but what we're going to do is find a way to make those effects inconsequential, and we can probably take 80% of this and put that into that bin. And then we have to figure out what is that 20%. What's the 20% that we cannot expose? And some of where you guys were going and what I want to laud is you have to make some trade-offs, right? And so as we talk about this in the conversation of a smart city, right, there's so much powerful good things that can come from this, but we have to go into this wide eye open, right, and say some of this stuff we're going to, hey, say, boy, it's really consequential if we get a bad guy manipulating that, right? And maybe we manage that infrastructure and that data flow in a different way. That's bringing cybersecurity into an anticipatory rather than reactive place.
That's absolutely where we have to be at. I think everyone on the stage would agree with the notion that it's essentially impossible to thwart all cyber threats. We were just talking before, and I had met with a company a few months ago, told me they have 100% threat detection and prevention rate, and as a technologist, you just understand that that's just not going to happen. Exactly. Take it from the expert right here. And Richard and Greg and our whole panel touched on a really important point, that we have to look at our data and, in a way, make a trade-off and conscious decision. What's the most valuable? What can we not have breached? And where are the areas that data is important and we're going to try to secure it, but that's not where our focus is. And in the context of smart city, bringing it a little bit more into the real world, I'd love to open up to our panel to your general thoughts on this. But if you take real world scenarios, we're moving toward autonomous vehicles, a lot of different technologies that are going to be impacting cities directly. How do we look at that model of taking 80% of the data or technology that's incorporated into cities, or looking at what is the model? Have we even thought about this deeply? Where do we need to be thinking about? And what is, if we're going to label a 20%, and maybe that's not even the correct number, that would certainly include the car, or is that more the software in the car? So I'd like to open that up to our panel. Does anyone want to take the first? Kris? Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been working on is redefining the risk assessment process. And when you come into the industry, you learn that you look at a system, you give it a risk score, and that system has that risk score until it changes. But that's no longer applicable. The systems are so interconnected, as you said before, that now we have to risk assess in a situational way. We have to predict the security or physical impact of a specific risk as it's perpetuated, not as it's how it affects multiple systems across different interconnected domains. So we've worked on a risk assessment process that gives us, if X happens, this specific security threat that I'm worried about, what are the ripple effects that it'll cause? What are the financial ramifications? And what are the other mission critical objectives that I won't meet if this risk perpetuates? Which allows us to prioritize where we spend our time trying to secure our data. So as we go through this process, a lot of times we find out that the risk that's perpetuated is a lot smaller than the risk we thought it would be. The risk of a DDoS attack against certain companies is pretty minimal, right? But they're spending $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year protecting against DDoS, whereas the risk of somebody changing a small file number in an ABN number could be tens of millions of dollars, as we found out. So we find through risk assessment where those things lie. And if we take a situational approach to risk assessment, we're much more accurate in predicting the impacts that we have, as well as we're much more productive in working towards goals that will actually make us more secure.
I was going to piggyback off that. I think as part of that risk assessment, an important pre-step is helping educate the people that are providing input into the risk assessment, providing them education around what are the risks, but also what are the assets at risk. I had an example where I had a client who was a company not here locally, but they were required to post financial information on a publicly accessible website as guided by their state legislation. Well, part of that information included very large dollar amounts of what their net worth was. And they had no understanding of what that risk was. So it wasn't until we walked through a specific situation and said, look, if this is publicly accessible, this means that anyone in the world can see how much you're worth, which was in the billions. They can then assess that, hey, it's probably going to be worth spending time and effort and money to do a phishing attack against your organization. Therefore, you're a very large target. Even though your business footprint's very small, you only have 30 employees, the amount of money flowing through your systems is a very large amount. So that was something they never considered. They never considered publishing a PDF document on a public website a risk. So as soon as that was realized by them, we were actually able to have a meaningful risk conversation. So I think that education process, because people's natural inclination is not to think, what can I do nefarious with this information? Usually the natural inclination is, well, what good can I do with this? But helping educate people in a way to say, look, there are risks out there, there are bad guys. You need to sometimes turn your business model upside down and look at how you can use your information against you to accomplish nefarious activities. And it's not always an easy thing to do, but it's a critical step in being able to help identify those risks.
So just an anecdote, in case you guys haven't figured it out, I like to tell stories. I've had teams deployed in Puerto Rico since the hurricane came through. And one of the things I've realized is that in that microcosm, while they're not necessarily a smart and connected community, The connectedness of that community was imperative to them, whether they realized it or not. The demand for not only cell services, but backhaul services to internet and other types of communication were incredibly important to their recovery process, both the restoration process, but also just the emergency response process. So one of the things I'd suggest that we do as a result of what we've seen happen in the USVI and in the Puerto Rican environment is actually go back and look at that and look in terms of the community impact and in terms of the things that we've learned there, and frankly, the things that were the most important to do as we began to restore and think about bringing those communities back to the whole that they were before the time of the hurricane.
And that's a great point, and I want to bring in Richard to go a little deeper in here. When I was working in Washington, we talked a lot about public-private partnerships. Yes, exactly. You can hear the response up here. So there is validity in having a public-private partnership in particular areas that could benefit both sectors. So Richard, how do you see this? What are the current obstacles, and what are potential solutions in reaching it?
Well, you just hit on it. So let me be as direct as I can. We should stop talking about a public-private partnership in cybersecurity. We should just stop, right? We've been talking about it for a quarter of a century, right? And the reason we should stop, because it's not the right model, right? When I wake up in the morning as a profit generating entity, right? Well, I'll give you an example, right? So if I'm an electric grid owner, right? And I wake up and I got malware on my system, right? The first thing I ask, lights on? Right? Second question I ask, lights going to be on tomorrow? And then I say, well, if the lights aren't going to be on tomorrow, it's probably not my problem. Something else happened really big and the state's going to come in on this, right? So I do a risk management calculus, right? And I decide whether or not that I can live with that because it's going to affect my operations or not. As a national security actor, right, I look at that same exact malware on that same exact critical infrastructure, and my first question is, how is that leverageable against me? Right? Under what conditions can a state actor or a non-state actor, whoever has put this on there, leverage that, right, to get to the possibility of affecting my sources of national power? Those are two fundamentally different ways of starting off eating my cereal in the morning, right? And so we should accept that we're actually starting off with very different interests in the morning. And what I would replace a partnership model with is an alignment model, right? And so an alignment model accepts the fact that we actually have a different starting point, right? And there are days in which I'm going to run in that channel of profit making, right? And I'm going to emphasize access and efficiency, right? But there are ways and places and spaces, right, where I can align that business model, right, to produce a better and more secure environment, right? So if you look at the British national cybersecurity policy that they released, strategy document they released in 2016, it's an interesting document in the sense that they actually say explicitly, our assumption that the private sector is going to produce security on its own is wrong. It's not going to happen, right? And again, it's still a Tory government, so they're not going to use the word regulation, right? But what they're talking about, and what I talked to them about when I was over there, as I said, what you're looking for is an alignment model. So stop with this partnership stuff. It's okay. We don't have to partner, right? We just have to align, right? And I think it should be telling, the fact that we've been talking about this for 25 years and we still haven't achieved it. Maybe that should tell us something, and we should rethink this, right? And that doesn't mean that there's certain specific things that you can't partner, right? A company goes to a university, right, and gives us money to do things. Hey, we can partner on that all the time, right? I actually think that's more about alignment than anything else. But I think it's more than just semantics, right? It's a different mindset that we have to get to. There's a national security perspective that doesn't trump the business model, right, in this space, and it never will, right? So the best, if we're really going to be realistic about this from a policy standpoint, is how can we align those actors in the critical places where it's consequential to sources of national power.
And I guess I'd like to go from there and look at the Internet of Things, where I think, again, we really can't expect private companies to provide security in IoT devices. It costs money, and unfortunately, you're not going to pay them extra for a more secure device for a couple of reasons. You know, a lot of people aren't aware of the security issues, but two, how do you know whether the so-called secure device is more secure or not? So a lot of people think, you know, Apple devices are more secure than Android devices. If you look at the count of vulnerabilities, actually is completely the opposite. On the other hand, if you look at the number of exploits, you might see Android targeted more, especially if you use third-party app stores. Android can be very different there. Overall, I'm not really sure there's a big difference in security there. It's more marketing on Apple's behalf, where they claim to be secure. And so we have to have some entity that's not the manufacturer to help us know whether things are secure. We could legislate it, go with a model like the FDA, and the FDA just started last year imposing some security requirements on medical devices. They're really just the very beginning of that process, though. And on the other hand, there's the possibility of having a private company certify devices. Like for the safety of electrical devices, you'll see that little UL logo for Underwriters Laboratory, and they certify the safety of electrical devices. And they've said they want to look into certifying the security of devices too. So there might be a private way of doing that, and if people actually look for that logo, then you might be able to pressure manufacturers into making secure devices. But until there's some form of external pressure and that external entity can really verify that something's secure or not, we're going to see more and more insecure devices. And like Kris was saying, these devices can be with us for a long, long time.
To piggyback on the alignment conversation, I think the best instance we've seen of alignment between the public and private sectors has been the NIST cybersecurity framework, in that it's a very widely accepted, very useful thing for both public and private entities. It's not, I definitely won't call it a partnership, because it is put together by NIST. It is driven by the government, but it's a very successful way for us to all get on the same page. And if I'm adopting the cybersecurity framework in a large way, while I'm not compliant, in a large way, I'm more predictable in the way that I'm going to handle your data, because I'm going to stick within the play sheet that I've been given. And that is most likely the brand that we're going to see for cybersecurity in the long term. And it also drives into the IoT space in a much more driven way, because of the fact that cities are buying these devices, governments are buying these devices, and we're going to have to understand both the cybersecurity and the privacy side of the cybersecurity framework as a vendor that wants to sell into those places in the long run. If they're putting those policies into place, I know what they are. They're out there, and I can participate in that and make a device that's ready to go for you. So that is not partnership at all. That's definitely alignment. And I couldn't agree more that we need more alignment, but we need more open standards, and we need to have a lot more open dialogue in order to achieve that.
Yeah, just because it's an interesting, I'd be interested to have you guys react to this. So the British right now are proposing, it hasn't gone through, it's going through parliamentary review, is to take something like the NIST framework, right, and say, again, it's voluntary, right? Ultimately, you can decide to move into this space or not. But if you wind up, this is for critical infrastructure to begin with, right? If you wind up being subject to a breach, and forensically, we determine that you weren't even close to these standards, then the government actually would fine you. There would be a retroactive fine and so piling on to the breach, or all the remediation costs and things of this nature, right? So it's not regulation, it's not telling you have to abide by these, but it's starting to change your risk calculus. And actually what the Brits are thinking what will happen is this will affect the insurance market, right? so that insurance premiums will now start to calculate in whether or not you're abiding by or complying to that framework, right? And it's a market-based solution, right, that the government is trying to, put into place some incentives and disincentives to create better alignment from that behavior. I'd be interested how you'd react to something like
I'm going to be provocative about this. So about 8 years ago at Cisco, I went out and hired a bunch of hackers. Guys that probably weren't criminals as a result, but they had that skill set. I brought them into Cisco, and I said, go after our products. I don't care what you think about the product in terms of your view of its security posture. I want you to see if you can break into that product. All of our products are compliant to some level. They follow a process. They didn't fail. I have never met a product just because it was compliant or because it followed a framework or a cookbook that meant a hacker couldn't get into it. Doesn't mean we don't need that stuff, because that takes kind of the noise floor down to a point that the more esoteric stuff can be found and we can deal with it. And the intention by me hiring those hackers was to go out and find those things that process was not going to fix on their own, that they could say, okay, if I was a real bad guy and I wanted to get after this product, here's how I would think in my twisted mind about going to do that. And then they would tell us what they did, and then we'd go get it fixed. So in addition to the things we were all just sitting here discussing, there's no substitute for the empiricism of actually sending somebody with that twisted, demented mental attitude to actually go try to hack into something to see if they can actually get into it, and then fixing it. And that's one of the things I want to always add to this discussion we were just having is there's no substitute for practical approach.
Richard and then Mark.
Yeah, I convinced the university a number of years ago that if I was actually going to do this, they had to fund as a research trip for me to go out and spend a weekend in Las Vegas with a bunch of 20-year-old delinquents, right?
You went to DEF CON.
I went to DEF CON, right? Because I had to understand and get into that mindset. And they allowed that to happen, right? But this is critical, right? The red team and the bug bounty and all of these types of exercises are absolutely part of best practices, right? And this is the point that the British approach is. It's just moving the ball, it's moving the floor up, right? It's not actually a ceiling, it's a floor. But it gets that sort of better best practice behavior going through the most critical industries that we need.
So I think in addition to looking at aspects of how you go about remediating or potentially penalizing organizations or municipalities that fail in their security practices, is a pre-step being able to understand what those inroads are. So for example, in a smart city concept, you have a traffic system with lights. A traditional means of looking at the vulnerabilities might be, well, how can I hack into that system to bring down the lights to cause traffic chaos? Someone else may take a different tact and say, well, I'm not going to worry about hacking into the system. I'm just going to try to not let the system scale. So at 3 o'clock, when there's high demand on the system can't scale, and there's still traffic chaos. You've basically achieved the same goal by 2 different ways. And that's one of the things I think when you start looking at smart cities, there's different ways to look at some of the problems. It may not be the same type of solution that would be applied in a business setting. So I think, again, that's one of the educational components that's really important with smart cities, is you need to look at things differently. And maybe the traditional solution that may have worked in the business world may not work in the realm of a smart city. Maybe something looking at more like national infrastructure or critical infrastructure, where again it's a little different model is being used. So I think as IoT vendors or legislators start looking at ways to implement things around smart cities, you might need to take a step back and kind of rethink the approach to stuff, because it may not be the approach that you think it is, or it could be something that's completely new that hasn't even been thought of.
That's a great point, Mark. And legislators are starting to think about this in small doses, and they are starting to put some legislative proposals. But I think that is an excellent point, that we don't know what we don't know. And so while we can focus on certain problems where we really have a deep understanding, there's still a lot to understand here, especially in the government that is behind in terms of knowledge of this panel. We are running out of time here, but we have an incredible panel. So I did want to open up to take at least one question quickly.
Sorry. Hopefully this will interest everybody. I have a question that really is an economic Actually, I'm directing this to you, Greg, but anybody could comment on it. And I'm wondering, what is a reasonable probability that the average corporation should expect to have some kind of cyber breach in a year? And related to that, how are we accounting for that in terms of dollars?
Okay, so I'll take a stab at it. We have a saying in my world that says there are two types of entities: those that have been hacked and know it, and those that don't know it. So the probability is that everyone has. As a matter of fact, I'll put a shameless plug out there. Cisco just published its mid-year cybersecurity report, and in it, it says that all enterprises in some way or another have been hacked. Now, in terms of the economic impact and in terms of what we do about it, so we've alluded to it up here, but let's call it out very explicitly. This is risk calculus. This is making decisions about what those assets are that are immutable, that have to be protected, vice those that don't. I spend a lot more time worrying about nuclear command and control infrastructure cybersecurity than I do about my kid playing on his Xbox at home. You know, let's just be honest with you. There are some things that are a little bit more important than others. The other thing that you have to think about is, as you think about that risk, you have to decide how you're going to, in some way, mitigate that risk. Insurance is a popular way to do it in the world we live in today. Legal balance, you know, if I get sued, what's my exposure, vice what it might cost me to defend myself, or what it might cost me to settle something. These are all a part of the risk calculus that we have to go through. So companies today are learning how to do this. If you go out and talk to any board of a public company anywhere in the United States or the world for that matter, there is a discussion going on about cyber risk and about how we balance that monetarily across the spectrum of our enterprises. So I'll stop there and let anybody else comment.
To expand on that, yeah, you asked what the likelihood is. 100%, it's going to happen. I've been doing a recent series of videos on how we manage risk and what we can do with the risk. On LinkedIn, once a week, I'm doing a video that explains the basics of how we manage risk and how we understand it. And first, it starts with alignment with what our mission is. Second, it starts with measuring the risk, and then we have to decide if we want to mitigate that risk or transfer that risk or what we want to do with it. But risk transference is definitely growing, and when we talk to companies now, and we've done several risk assessments, Mark and I have done a couple together over the past year, we're actually building in estimates on fines into those risk calculations, saying, hey, if we see this happen, we estimate, if it's in the EU right now with GDPR, we estimate that this is going to be a 10 million euro fine, or it could be 4% of your global annual revenue. And we'll estimate that says, if this happens, these fines are likely to happen. And we're seeing cybersecurity insurance providers actually starting to write fines in to sublimits, saying that if you're fined, your sublimit for that fine is $1 million. You may have a $50 million policy, but we're seeing that becoming such a huge cost to cybersecurity insurers that it's now being sublimited out. And you want to be very careful about the cybersecurity insurance policy that you choose based on the amount of fine that you could expect.
We have to accept the fact that this is simultaneously a vulnerable and highly resilient environment. And we have to actually learn to live with that, right? That's the consequences of interconnectedness, right? Medieval feudalism was not interconnected, right? And so moats and walls worked all right back then, right? For a little while, right? And I think we're understanding that now, right? And so what does security look like when you accept vulnerability, right, and reinforce resiliency, right? And resiliency, and this is, I think, really important in terms of the way we rethink this, is it does not have to be reactive, right? Resiliency is a proactive, anticipatory behavior of getting ahead of the bad guys, right? And if you're really good at that, then you can seize and gain, you can gain and seize and retain initiative in this space. And you're going to be more secure than the guy next to you or the gal.
Just
Did you want to quickly, and then we have
sure. I was just going to add that, I think to kind of piggyback off the themes that have been brought up here, I think as far as the economic cost, there's going to be a cost regardless. It's just a matter of how much of a cost, but you also need to look at the non-financial costs. If a company goes through a breach and it becomes public, you now have a branding issue. You have a loss in confidence. You have employee morale issues. I think there was a statistic I saw somewhere that said most companies that suffer a major breach don't actually survive, a year or two down the road. So I think having that mindset of, we'll never be breached, is just it's not a realistic mindset. You will be breached. You will at minimum you will be tested, and hopefully the controls you have in place will be able to thwart that potential hack in such a way that you can use that as a learning experience. I have had clients who have been in a situation where they have been hacked, but because of the controls they had in place, it minimized the impact significantly. I've also had clients where they did think, well, we'll never be breached, we'll never be hacked because we have nothing of interest. And when they are hacked, they quickly learn that there is quite a bit of interest. So I think the mindset should be that everyone's a target. There is a cost regardless. It's a matter of how you go about allocating those funds and allocating that money to protect against the various threats, and then also to consider the non-financial costs as well, because they can be just as detrimental.
Well said. I want to thank our incredible panel here today. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours and hours, and we'd enjoy it. I hope the audience too. But I'd also like to give a warm round of applause for our panelists. They did fantastic. And we'll be sticking around for a few minutes, but I know we have other programmatic events going on, so I don't want to keep anyone here. But thank you for attending, and just let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.